Well, welcome everyone to the first in our summer series, organised by the Orthodox Fellowship of St John the Baptist, entitled Through the Prayers of Our Holy Fathers and Mothers. My name is Margaret Haig and I'm the current chair of the Fellowship. The Fellowship brings together Orthodox Christians from the different traditions in the British Isles and Ireland through talks, pilgrimages, conferences and youth festivals. And if you'd like to find out more about the Fellowship and consider becoming a member, please look at our website and I'll put the link in the chat shortly. A bit of advance news. Next year, we will be organising an in-person summer conference and would like you to save the date. This will be on 25th to the 29th of August, so later than we might normally meet, 2022, and will be held in the beautiful and holy place of Walsingham in Norfolk. We're excited to announce that we will be joined by Father Stephen de Young, author of The Religion of the Apostles and co-host of the Lord of All Spirits podcast on Ancient Faith Radio. The working title of the conference is Angelic Beings, and we hope to open applications in September, so please look out for that. As I've already mentioned, the session this evening will be recorded for those people who could not be with us live and added to our YouTube channel. We're pleased to offer the sessions for free. However, we do welcome donations to the Fellowship, which we will use to help reduce the cost of the 2022 conference so that more people can attend. This summer series focuses on some of the important saints and witnesses of the 20th century. Tonight, we begin the series by hearing about Father Nikolai Steinhardt, a Romanian intellectual and writer who was imprisoned under communism and was baptized while in prison. Future sessions will be on St. Silouan and St. Sophrony, St. Maria of Paris, Metropolitan Anthony of Surosh, Father Alexander Men, and St. Porphyrius and Eldress Gavrilia. This evening, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Razvan Porumb to present to us. This is the second time he's spoken to us about Father Nikolai after a wonderful talk at our 2017 summer conference. Razvan has taken his doctorate through the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies and the Cambridge Theological Federation on the topic of orthodoxy and ecumenism. His book on this theme has been recently published by Peter Lang. Razvan had previously completed an MA in pastoral theology, also through IOX. He previously worked for the Metropolis of Moldavia in Iași, Romania, as editor-in-chief at Trinitas Press, where he supervised and was involved in the publication and translation of numerous books and journals, an activity he enjoyed for almost 9 years. Razvan has always had a special interest in ecumenism, being involved in various ecumenical milieu and projects. Razvan's initial BA from the Cuza University in Iași, Romania, was in literature, which explains his constant interest in literature and his fascination with Father Nikolai Steinhardt, which dates back to his studentship days. At the end of his presentation, there will be the opportunity for you to ask questions. Please type these into the chat and we will address as many as we can at the end. Now, hopefully most of you are familiar now with Zoom, as we've got used to Zoom over the past year and a half. But just in case you're not familiar, if you're accessing Zoom by computer or laptop, then probably the chat function will be down at the bottom with a speech bubble. If you're accessing on a smartphone or an iPad or similar, a tablet, you might have to swipe the screen to find the chat. But please do make sure you include your questions. You can put them in as you go along, and you can switch off the chat notifications if you find that distracting during the presentation. I do suggest you go on to speaker view when you are ready. So if you go to the view function and select speaker view rather than gallery view, you'll be able to see Razvan and his presentation in a full screen. Right. Before I hand over to Razvan, I will just say a prayer so that we begin our session in a good frame of mind and a calm frame of mind. So, Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us from all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. I now hand over to Razvan and ask him to share his screen and begin his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and Hello to you all. A pleasure to see you. I will now share my screen in the hope that all will go well. Here it is. And this hopefully is visible to you all.
Yes, that's showing. Thank you.
So this presentation, as Margaret mentioned already, is in a sense a continuation to a lecture on Father Nicolae Steinhardt I gave 4 years ago, also for the Fellowship of St. John the Baptist, which in turn was based on another shorter lecture I had given for the Orthodox Institute in Cambridge. Today's presentation attempts to touch upon things that were not explored during my previous talks, or indeed on things that were perhaps only mentioned in passing. What's exciting, however, is that today's presentation carries some good news with it, which I'm happy to share with you even before any official announcement is made. After each of my previous presentations, I could only shrug helplessly when people asked me if a translation of Father Nicolae had been published in English, or indeed if such an edition was in the works. And the answer was a puzzled no from me to both those questions at the time. And now, before you even ask, I am pleased to announce that such a translation is being prepared as we speak by St. Vladimir Seminary Press. And I'm even more excited to say that I will also play a small part in this forthcoming edition. So do keep an eye on the website of St. Vladimir Seminary Press and do keep track of their new books. I think there is a chance for Steinhardt's Journal of Joy to be published as early as this year. This is actually the first change you'll notice. The title of the book will actually be Journal of Joy, not Diary of Happiness, as I referred to it in the past, for those who saw my previous presentations. But first, let me briefly reintroduce the character of Steinhardt and his masterpiece, the Journal of Joy, with which we are mainly concerned in our discussion today. At the start of today's presentation, I will quickly rehash a few things some of you may be familiar with by way of an introduction. So, Nico Aurelian Steinhardt, later to become Father Nicolae Steinhardt, was born in 1912 near Bucharest to a Jewish father and a Christian mother. He received a diploma in 1934 from the School of Law and Literature of the University of Bucharest. He completed a PhD in 1936 in constitutional law. He began his literary career in the 1930s, so very early on, with publications in both Romanian and French. In 1959, during the great communist purge of intellectuals and dissidents, he refused to testify as a witness at a trial against the Romanian philosopher Constantin Noica. As a consequence of his refusal, Steinhardt was accused of conspiracy against the social order and sentenced to 13 years of forced labor. He served his sentence in the prisons of Jilava, Gherla, and Aiud from 1960 until 1964, when he was released as part of the general amnesty for all political prisoners, having served only 4 years of his sentence. Now, his experience in prison brought about a major change in his life, which indeed the book we are talking about here, the Journal of Joy, attempts to describe. His prison experiences brought about not only Steinhardt's spiritual conversion to Christianity, but a longer journey which eventually led to his joining an Orthodox monastery in Western Romania, where he became Father Nicolae. He started his prison journey in Jilava's cell 34 and to give you an example what that kind of looked like, which in his own words was a kind of a long and dark tunnel. It had many of the powerful elements of a nightmare. It's a cave, it's a canal, it's a subterranean intestine, cold and deeply hostile. It's a barren mine, it's an extinct volcano crater. It's a pretty successful image of a discolored hell, he says. And yet, and this is the crux of everything of the book, and of Steinhardt's life, and yet he continues, in this almost fanciful, unreal, and sinister place, I was to know the happiest days of my life. How absolutely happy I was in room 34. Not even in Brasov with my mother in my youth, not even on mysterious London's unending streets. He was a great admirer of London. Not even on the beautiful hills of Musgel, not even in Lucerne's postcard blue decor, no, nowhere. So we also have the actual background of this joyful experience, and it looks a bit not entirely promising. Now, on 15th of March 1960, in the prison of Jelava, Steinhardt is baptized into the Orthodox faith by the monk and priest Mina Dobzeu, having as witnesses 2 Roman Catholic priests, 2 Greek Catholic priests, and the Protestant pastor. A deliberate choice intended to give his baptism an ecumenical character, as he himself wrote. Having encountered Christ through the baptism, the accompanying happiness torments him in prison, deep in the night, preventing him from sleeping. In his words, my superabundance made me want to jump out of bed or the bunk, to run, to scream for joy, to shake the others, tell them how happy I am, beg them to realize what a treasure they all possess, what a wonderful little stove, what a sedative without a medical prescription. It was this drive that stayed with him to the end of his days, urging him, among other things, to write his witnessing journal and to obstinately ensure its eventual publication. After his release from prison, encouraged by his friends, Steinhardt resumes his literary activity, publishing translations, essays, and literary criticism. He remains, however, under strict surveillance, and his Securitate file is swelling by the day. Securitate was the secret service of the Romanian Communist Party. In this Securitate file, we now find characterizations of Steinhardt that are almost flattering, which I found really amusing in a sense and surprising. So in a surprisingly perceptive note, one informant describes him thus. So we could see here in these are all pictures from the Secret Service file. So these are all pictures of him being photographed on the street through hidden cameras from suitcases, briefcases, and from undercoats. So this is the reality he was living in, and we have these, well, somewhat sinister pictures of him taken by the Securitate. And actually, this, what we have here, the little fragment, is from a report from a Securitate agent. And to me, it seems pretty accurate. Having come out of detention, he says, in 1964, an older proclivity of his, Steinhardt's, towards Orthodox Christianity strengthened, something also confirmed through his baptism. His studies become increasingly richer and specialized in the field of theology and Eastern patristics, without abandoning an astonishingly diverse reading in all the areas of humanistic culture and even modern science. This is what the Securitate had to say about him. Of course, many other nasty things, but we'll focus on that for now. So as he navigated the peculiar difficulties and vicissitudes characteristic to life in a totalitarian state, Steinhardt would often come across as an antiquated, Don Quixotic figure, always somehow at odds with his environment. Predictably, he admired Cervantes' work immensely. He was a great admirer of Cervantes. His whole appearance was rather extraordinary. He had a thick curly beard, which served to emphasize even more his boldness, says one of his friends, but also his entire appearance. He scrutinized the surroundings with oblique looks. His attention was constantly awake, so that despite his ascetic physical features, his posture was rather that of a brave and seasoned soldier. Did we, by any chance, have Don Quixote in our midst again? Another friend describes him as rather short, with swift, even impatient movements, with gestures that seem abruptly interrupted. He appears to be in a constant dialogue, not with the persons around him, but with an invisible, treasured interlocutor who accompanies him everywhere. Equally fascinating is his look, piercing, playful, ironic, vaguely suspicious. It speaks as eloquently as his sparkling phrase. Now, a very unusual portrayal of Steinhardt comes from another friend who produced this rather outlandish description, as she herself acknowledges, but which I found very interesting. She says, in any conversation, even an ordinary one, he was in an unusual state of tension. The way he listened, the way in which he very visibly was preparing his reply, was that of a being that is entirely participative, in a state of perpetual watchfulness. There was in his eyes and in his facial expression that concrete presence. When watching him, you got that same feeling you get from those electric monitors signaling vitals by the heads of those hospitalized in intensive care. This is an odd comparison, but she herself acknowledges, the author, that she just could not come up with something better. So pregnant that image was in her mind when she was interacting with Fr Nicolae. So he was certainly not, as many are tempted to picture him, the archetypal, serene, white-bearded sage, thus conforming to a cliched canon of saintly figures, but a somewhat pugnacious individual in state of hypervigilance, akin, as his outstanding monographer Adrian Mureșan perceptively puts it, akin to the constantly on guard state of PTSD sufferers. In 1980, Steinhardt is tonsured a monk at Rohia Monastery in Western Romania, where he becomes integrated into the life of the monastery and is assigned the task of administering its substantial 23,000 volume library. He continues to write books and articles, and he establishes himself as a prominent, albeit constantly scrutinized, essayist of those times. He remains, even throughout his monastic years, a rebel and a dissident, and almost all of his writings, be they on literature or theology or any other topic, present the occasional subversive underthread, including in the texts which needed to pass through the censorship of the authorities. This was the familiar tense game one had to engage in dealing with the censorship apparatus of those days. Any subversion or subtext needed to be deftly observable, but also subtle enough to escape the attention of the censors. And Steinhardt was a master of this game. This constant dissidence has made modern researchers like Adrian Mureșan, whom I've mentioned already, to speak of subversion as a constant implicit over-character or a supra-character. in all of Steinhardt's writing. There is always an element of subversion. Steinhardt's subversion is subordinate to a never-ending ethical debate against any constraining or reductionist formula, a device which he never turns off and which Mureșan deems resistance through culture. Steinhardt tirelessly questions and analyzes any false utopic revolutionary which can often mask dystopic distortions. Now, what we can see here on the left-hand side is an actual manuscript from the Rohia Monastery, from their museum. It is a third copy. He had to write it again and again because it kept being confiscated by the Secret Service. So this is the third manuscript, if I'm not mistaken. But this is what all manuscripts which circulated in Samizdat at the time must have looked like. So his journal, about which we speak today, is comprised of seemingly random fragments, memories intersected by stories, but mostly thoughts and reflections. Chunks of stories and reflections are often preceded by the name of a place and associated with a month and year, which locates the respective episode in space and time. Larger chunks of text are often divided by smaller passages, serving as interludes which relay tidbits of information, of conversations, mostly from prison, often unrelated to the main text, humorous and extremely diverse. The prisoners talk about French equivalents for obscure Romanian words, opinions on historical events, and relate anecdotes on various themes. These unconnected but sparkling paragraphs bear an equally playful subtitle, Boogie Mambo Ragtime, a selection of music and dance styles which hints at the unusual mishmash of ideas, topics, and exchanges characteristic to that particular prison universe. Because communist prisons in Romania of those years would often end up being rather busy places of cultural effervescence, filled to the brim as they were with the cream of academic and scholarly society. In their spare time, in order to preserve their sanity and clarity, the illustrious prisoners would often form scientific, literary, and philosophical clubs in the cell, particularly in the larger cells, which hosted sometimes over 100 prisoners. And they were teaching courses in their respective fields. A large prison cell would often resemble a miniature university, with different courses being taught in different parts of the room. Everybody, graduates and unschooled alike, could choose the course of their liking. By the end of their stay in prison, inmates often ended up as educated as people who had attended the top universities of the country. Steinhardt's specialization was English, you'll be pleased to find out, while other available classes, between inverted commas, taught by colleagues of his included Sanskrit, history of culture, general biology, and philosophy of law. Moreover, prisoners could listen to narrations of masterpieces like Mann's Dr. Faustus, Chouret's Great Initiates, or Ionesco's Victims of Duty. In fact, this play by Ionesco, in Steinhardt's own interpretation, aroused considerable interest within the prison walls, where a heterogeneous and unexpected public in jail clothes applauds this piece of Ionesco, in Steinhardt's words, more probably than the public in evening wear at the La Huchette Theatre in France. In my previous presentation, I spoke about the unifying thread of the paradox, which runs through Steinhardt's reflections in his journal, the apparent contradiction implicit in the Christian faith. Paradox is already evident in the title of the book, a chronicle of the author's experiences in the unspeakably vicious Romanian prison system under communism, but focusing on the joy the author encountered therein. The book's motto is quoting the Gospel of Mark 9:24, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, which introduces us to this central theme of paradox. And these words, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, about them Steinhardt wrote, never have more astounding words been uttered. He was fascinated with the idea that you believe and not believe at the same time. Logic plays no part in this any longer. The narrative core of the Journal of Joy is Nico's baptism in prison. Nico was his name before baptism. So his are not mere theological or philosophical reflections. They actually describe an event, a concrete commitment, an act of faith. Nor is this act something simple or straightforward. To become baptized in that epoch, let alone in prison of all places, was tantamount almost to a crime. His prison baptism was the quintessential act of dissension, if you like, performed right under the nose, as it were, of the terrifying ruling power in a time when dissidents were few and revered almost as martyrs, since protesting against the regime very often meant death. Now, his baptism occurred stealthily and is described in the book, as you'll see, as a sequence of quick, silent movie-like movements, almost suggestive of an allegorical mystery play. They had to use water infested with worms for the communion in that particular context. And the future Father Nicolae's journey of new life is thus set in motion. And he continues to explore in wonderment the mystical reality that slowly but constantly reveals itself from behind the sordid prison tableau. He's not alone in defying this somber, dehumanizing environment. Other inmates demonstrate the same stubborn, dignified denial while accepting the calamity surrounding them. Shaking with cold, hungry and thirsty, covered in slimy, sticky soot, and braving pestilential stench. The prisons do not deal with it as a tragedy, says Father Nicolae, but remain kind and polite. Kind and joyous, he says, as only folks in prisons can be. Foreshadowing of the monk's quietude or of heavenly joy. These are his words. Now, 3 years following his baptism, while still in prison, Steinhardt has a powerful epiphany, which confirms once again the profound sacramental dimension to his conversion. In unspeakably harsh and degrading circumstances, really unspeakable, he is granted a mystical encounter with Christ. Falling into a heavy sleep one night, he has a vivid dream, a vision. And these are his words, and you can see them on the screen. I don't see Christ the Lord incarnate, only a huge light, white and bright, and I feel unspeakably happy. The light surrounds me from all parts. It's total joy, and it does away with everything. I'm bathed in blinding light. I float in light. I am in light, and I exult. I know that it will last forever. It is perpetuum immobile. I am, the light says to me, not through words, but through the transmission of thought. I understand that it's the Lord, that I'm within the light of Tabor, that I don't merely see it, but also dwell in its midst. Over and above everything, I'm happy, happy, happy. And I know that I am, and I say it to myself. And it's as if the light were brighter than light. And it's as if it spoke and told me who it was. It seems to me that the dream lasted long, very long. The joy not only lasts a long time, but also always increases. If evil has no bottom, then goodness has no ceiling. The circle of light grows even ever wider, and the joy, after it has enveloped me silkily, suddenly changes its tactics, becomes firm, throws itself, trundles itself upon me like avalanches that anti-gravitationally lift me up. Then again it proceeds otherwise. Tenderly, it cradles me, and in the end, bluntly, it replaces me. I no longer am. No, I am, but so strong that I no longer recognize myself. There are parts of the journal, and this fragment in particular, when the reader feels they are departing from the storyteller and chronicler's realm and entering the realm of revelation, of witnessing to Christ's truth in a manner reminiscent of the Philokalia and the lives of the saints. Just like in the writings of the saints, Steinhardt's confession is so direct, so pure, so in awe of God, yet familiar, that it manages to convey the shivering wonder of an encounter with the living God. It is the whispered but overpowering confession of someone who, though immersed in an earthly hell, is witnessing to the all-conquering power of heaven. This fragment best explains the title of the book and its overarching theme of joy. As experienced by Steinhardt, happiness is not a state. It is not an experience, even mystical. It is something much more. It is a person. It is the force of an unbeatable army, omnipotent and infinitely benevolent. Evil may be bottomless, but so is love, kindness, and joy. For Steinhardt, Christ is present in the midst of our suffering, amid putridness and chaos, and he turns such contexts into noble, gracious, and joyful situations where human kindness and generosity prevail. More than anything, faith brings joy, presented here not just as a gentle, comforting caress, but also as a force, a mighty assailant, an army, crushing all that is improper, all that is evil, replacing it violently with happiness. Christianity, he wrote, Steinhardt, is dogma, mysticism, morality, it's everything. But it is especially a way of life and the solution and the recipe for happiness. So Christianity, a recipe for happiness. Now, a lot can be said, of course, about the way prisons and the more general loss of freedom impacted and in many ways enriched, paradoxically, the communities of faith plagued by this most recent of persecutions in modern history, the communist dictatorial regimes of Eastern and Central Europe and Russia. Because of course, Steinhardt's experience in communist prisons was one of many, not only in Romania, but in the entire communist bloc. He joins the ranks of many other dissident writers of Soviet times, like Pasternak, Solzhenitsyn, Bulgakov, Bukovsky, Zamyatin. It is with Solzhenitsyn that he shares the theme of conversion, of metanoia, of finding the path of faith, a theme which in Steinhardt occupies a central place. Solzhenitsyn's cry, "Bless you, prison, for being in my life," seems to prefigure the joy Steinhardt was to explore later in his own memoir. In those troubled days, Romanian jails detained around 17,600 political prisoners, many of whom were priests or monks, Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Protestant. As many of these were in fact imprisoned for their faith, or as a consequence of it, there is more and more talk in today's Romania of the saints or martyrs of communist prisons, among whom the figure of Fr Nicolae Steinhardt would count as one of the most popular. Interestingly, the Holy Synod of the Romanian Orthodox Church will soon review 12 proposals for canonization for the year 2025. All of those proposals concerning figures of the Church who are persecuted in communist prisons. These proposals also include Father Dumitru Stăniloae and Father Cleopa Ilie, better known internationally and to the English-speaking public through translations, of course, though sadly not Father Nicolae Steinhardt, at least not yet. I've managed to find this portrait of his as a, well, it's not an icon, but it's hopefully prefiguring an icon. Now, at the risk of oversimplifying the theme, my question is there anything that connects these faith experiences in prison? The context is extremely complex, and I only have time to focus on two aspects, which I will try to connect with Steinhardt's theological themes in his Journal of Joy. So first, exposure to the prison context has enabled, among many of those who experience the torture of totalitarian states, a deep existential living of faith, a new life impregnated with deep prayer, with an intense and perceptible sense of sacramental purpose and familiarity. The second aspect, to which perhaps most of today's presentation will be devoted, is that of freedom. In Steinhardt, both these elements are brought together in a complementary tension, though freedom for him implies rather complex ramifications, as we will soon see. But let's briefly approach two other examples, just to see how the life and faith of those tortured in prisons changed. Father Dumitru Stăniloae, soon most likely to become Saint Dumitru, would speak very little about his prison experience. It was an area he wished to avoid, if at all possible. However, when pressed to share what had marked him most during his years in prison, Father Stăniloae said that in prison I learned to pray. His interlocutors were stunned. How so? You didn't pray before? I did, Father Stăniloae replied, but I prayed out of custom, out of habit. In jail, when you do not know whether you will get out alive or not, connection with God is your only chance not to lose your identity and hope. So then true prayer really becomes the vital breath of the soul, not in a metaphorical sense, but in an existential one, he says. So we can say that prayer ceases to be theology and becomes life, the core of our existence. Now, Patriarch Daniel of Romania, who was a disciple of Father Stăniloae, to whom he was very close, he recounts witnessing Father Dumitru pray when they once prayed together. It was a simple, profound, delicate prayer, remembers the Patriarch, without any elaborate theological ideas. Father Dumitru would only say, Lord, help us, Lord, be with us, Lord, forgive us, just as a child talks to his father, a simplicity that can be seen only in country people who have never gone through a theological school, but who pray with much conviction and faith in stunning intimacy and familiarity with God. Father Dumitru actually later advised the then young theologian, the greatest temptation is to theologize during prayer, because then you are not talking to the Lord, you are talking with yourself about him. Now, another revelatory witness concerning faith forged in captivity comes from Father Sergei Ovsyannikov, an erudite Russian priest who serves in the Netherlands and whose beautifully put together book, entitled Journey to Freedom, translated and published into English last year, describes his conversion, which also started in a Soviet prison in the 70s. Our dear friend Gladys has kindly drawn our attention to this extraordinary book. The future Father Sergei encountered God while reflecting in his cell, despondently at the time, on the theme of freedom. In a moment of despair, when he nearly became convinced that freedom was a delusion, he heard the words, "Freedom can only be in God," words accompanied by a transfiguration of his surroundings. This came as an absolute surprise, as God was never among Ovsyannikov's preoccupations, since he was an atheist at the time, or agnostic at best. Father Sergei's subsequent life was marked by a profound feeling of thankfulness, which I would dare call another form of prayer. Be thankful, Father Sergei urges, and he immediately communes with Steinhardt through the all-encompassing theme of joy. And I'll just read this amazing fragment. Joy comes to a thankful soul, he says. During a walk, I quietly found and opened my little flask of joy, he says. I began to give thanks simply, without any particular reason. But thankfulness works with the heart, not with any mental reason, because it sets joy in motion. I began to give thanks, and joy inexplicably appeared. Suddenly, I realized that all the people I meet are saying, hello. These people are strangers to me, yet they are turned out to be drawn into the joy that came to me in response to my thankfulness. Greetings, my joy, they said in response to my smile. That is what I heard, because we all turned out to be in the same sphere of giving thanks. Ovsyannikov sees freedom in Christ, the only true freedom, not as knowledge or understanding resulting from mental processes, but as an encounter. And here he's inspired, as he himself confesses, by Metropolitan Anthony of Surosh, an encounter which replaces us, renews us completely, so that we can speak of a birth into a new life. Life begins, Father Sergei writes, with a joyful moment when you realize that God has not given you this life by chance. Life is the combination of the will of God and the coming out into freedom of a newborn man. You come out and there is joy and gladness. And we note here the same theme of renewal, of replacement, as encountered in Steinhardt's experience. Now, Fr Nicolae also sees freedom in close connection with spiritual life, as prayer releases the human being, in his words, from servitude, both to external nature and to himself. The world has no meaning, says Fr Nicolae, except as a sphere for dialogue between God and men. Men respond to the deeds of God in the world with deeds of their own, but in their prayer, they ask God to intervene. A similar ethos can be encountered in Father Nicolae Steinhardt. His own spiritual life began in prison, not only through his own personal prayer, but by the living of the liturgy. And how did that happen in prison? A fellow prisoner knew the Holy Liturgy by heart, word for word. He explains it to the future Father Nicolae in great details. He recites it to him again and again with infinite patience, the entire liturgy, until Steinhardt also knows it entirely by heart. This is how they celebrated liturgy. The humble context does not in any way diminish or weaken the spiritual power of the Eucharistic liturgy, but renders it, in Steinhardt's view, more powerful and intimate. And this is what he says. The text of the liturgy, unaccompanied by organ or choir, scent or myrrh, hieratic movements, lights and colors, movements and rhythms, comes across to me in all its ascendant and tragic power, happening-like, which culminates with the sensational moment of the double calling, take, eat, drink of this, all of you. The sober decoration of the cell, the ash-like stones and black iron, retains the words and trips up the upsurge of sentiment and imagination. It's a tight game. This is what it must have been like in the hall of the Sanhedrin. It's the moment of truth, and Christ crucified confronts us. We must look him straight in the face, confront him, stare at the spectacle of torture, be spectators in his crucifixion. About his prayer, about Father Nicolae's prayer, we'll quote one of his friends. When he talked about Jesus, or generally about God, or when he was praying, he displayed an astounding power, which you could feel almost palpably. I heard him praying at times, for he observed very strictly the program of the monastery, and it was truly overwhelming. I would often accompany him to the all-night vigil, and his prayers were shattering. He simply spoke with God. He sat kneeling in the altar and cried out like a character in the Old Testament. He brought forth his prayer from the depths of his being in a way that stirred you. God was a person he could see, with whom he could talk. There was an urgency in his prayer I've never witnessed in other people. All those who heard him praying, be they monks, friends, or regular people visiting the monastery, were shocked by the power of his prayer. Impressed and astonished, the younger novices of the monastery would say, if God doesn't hear Father Nicolae, who then will he hear? If joy or happiness is what imbues Steinhardt's journal, this too is inextricably linked to freedom. The theme of freedom is central in the journal, not only by virtue of the concentrationary confined universe from which the author wrote, but is fundamental also to his worldview. In relation to freedom, the author quotes almost obsessively the Kierkegaardian refrain. The opposite of sin is not virtue. The opposite of sin is freedom. A phrase which is for him the most extraordinary thought ever read, except for the gospel texts. The opposite of sin is freedom. Steinhardt reveals freedom's connection with joy. In order to distinguish the Christian from the caricature or imitation, there's no procedure more certain than investigating whether the aspirant is or isn't cheerful and content. If the person is intolerant or sullen or agitated or sad or upset, he's not a Christian, no matter how faithful to virtue. The Christian is free, hence happy. Indeed, Giorgio Ardeleanu, one of the foremost monographers of Steinhardt, spoke about a triangle of faith, freedom, happiness, which function as theological core and central theme of Steinhardt's journal. Faith, freedom, happiness. The theme of freedom remains present throughout, whether directly stated or as implicit undercurrent. For Steinhardt, freedom implies responsibility and involvement, and by association, faith becomes a deeply active, dynamic, participatory concept. In his view, the Christian spirit is active, always ready to engage. He repeatedly voices outrage whenever he sees, in his words, how Christianity is confused with stupidity, with a kind of cowardly and stupid piety, a bon dieuserie, he says. This is a term he himself coined from the French bon Dieu, denoting some form of false pietism. Steinhardt is vehemently against any perception of Christianity as a passive, submissive, or resigned piousness. He best encapsulates his views through a humorous fragment in a different book, where he retells a story about a group of monks who experience a blackout while they were praying. One of the monks goes to the fuse box to fix the problem, while the others pray on for the light to return. Contrary to the originator of the story, Steinhardt believes strongly the only really faithful person is the one ready to change the fuse. The others are falsely pious, shamelessly tempting God. In his words, would they wish for Christ to descend from heaven with the fuse? Moreover, as freedom implies absolute responsibility and engagement, faith can never be coerced, but must always be grounded in absolute freedom. Steinhardt is irked by a tendency of a segment of the intelligentsia of his day to welcome certain elements of morality-based censorship applied by the communist state. He doesn't have much patience with certain priests either, who make haste with fiery words of praise in approving the moral measures taken by some totalitarian governments, the abolition of prostitution, the prohibition of abortion, complicating divorce. They have in mind, I believe, more the letter and severities rather than the spirit in which such measures are grounded. For the spirit can't blow except where there is freedom and where virtue issues from free will. Sins and temptations are to be dissolved following the faithful's free choice, and certainly not as a consequence of imposition, prohibition, or autocratic official decrees. Steinhardt never allows himself to rest on any comforting preconceptions, neither when it comes to his perceptions of culture or philosophy, nor when it comes to his faith or theology. His state of hypervigilance, his persistent monitoring of his interlocutors and surroundings with the precision of an electronic instrument, his constant parallel dialogue with an invisible companion, denote, I think, an intense, never-ceasing form of prayer of the existential kind of which Staniloae also spoke. While doing so, however, he, at the same time, continues to work in the service of freedom, cause which implied for him a constant calling and responsibility to wrestle and engage tirelessly in ethical polemics. We see in him an interweaving of the two elements, prayer and an avid search for freedom, manifested as perennial combative engagement, rooted in a life of profound prayer. Not surprisingly, since he understood faith as active, a participatory endeavor, his ceaseless prayer took the form of vigilance, awakeness, or nepsis. In a sense, we encounter the same underlying commitment to freedom and responsibility in all of Steinhardt's unabated explorations, both before and after his tonsure as a monk. He remains a nonconformist, never ceasing to engage with a variety of cultural forms, everywhere searching for Christ's truth, sometimes perhaps in rather unexpected places, and formulating opinions that strict adherence to doctrine may find challenging. His admiration, for instance, for the pop rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar, which he finds profoundly Christian, and to which he devotes an ample commentary in the journal, is likely to have raised a few eyebrows. Still is, I think, likely to raise a few eyebrows. As indeed with his admiration towards Dali's paintings, whom he considers to be a great Christian artist, or his constant addiction, as he calls it, to cinema, praising films like Antonioni's Blow Up Kubrick's Clockwork Orange or Fellini's Dolce Vita. The last, Fellini, revealing to Steinhardt an enormous Christian faith. He's absolutely a great admirer of Fellini. And about his nonconformist side, on a funnier note, we could mention perhaps his eccentric monastic habits of listening to rock records in his cell, of raising cats, he was an avid cat lover, or of indulging in far too many showers, thus stretching the boiler capacity of the monastery. That caused a bit of a problem, reminded with affection by the community to this day. Now, so I just wanted to say a few words. I don't have much time left. But interestingly, perhaps, in terms of the way he sees faith as something active or proactive, if you like, I thought it was interesting the way he would react, perhaps, with regard to some of the excesses emerged during our current pandemic crisis. He would have little patience for what he sees as a defective assimilation of tradition, denouncing any firm conviction that we escape diseases through faith, that we don't need doctors and medicine, since we can always heal ourselves through prayers, in his words. An attitude synonymous for him with tempting God with the exigency of a miracle. God surely performs miracles, he says, but when he so wills, and these miracles are not obtained through summons. And I think I will end with an observation which just came to me these days, and the Romanian listeners will understand best what I mean. But it's a particularity of the Romanian language. The biblical Beatitudes are translated in Romanian using the other meaning of the original Greek makarioi, as the joys, the happinesses. So instead of saying blessed, Romanians say joyful. For instance, joyful are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Or they say, happy are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And I would add another beatitude by paraphrasing the writer Virgil Iarunca from Romania. Joyful are those who read the journal of joy, he said at one point. So do keep an eye on the news of St. Vladimir's Seminary Press. That joy could soon be yours too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Razvan. That was a fantastic presentation of the Journal of Joy. I like the alliteration as well. That fits very nicely. But I think the Journal of Joy, I will certainly be looking out for it from St. Vladimir's Seminary Press, and I hope we can all enjoy that in due course later this year, perhaps next year, whenever it comes out. I am going to fill a little time while we wait for people to post their questions in the chat. We do have one already, and I realized I forgot to put in the link to the website of the of the fellowship. I'll do that later. But just to start off, we have a question from Elizabeth, who's asking about the experience in prison. So asking, were there common criminals mixed in with these illustrious political prisoners and confessors? If so, do we have any stories of the interaction with them or the effect on them of encountering such people?
I don't think they mixed that much. I think I can't say 100% with certainty, but I think if there were cases of common criminals, those would have been exceptions. And I believe there were special cells, and they were the worst kind, as far as I understand, devoted to political prisoners who were seen as a grave, threat to the regime and traitors to the country and stuff like that. So I don't know for sure if there were such instances. They were rare, and I can't recall them being treated in the book. Yes, Father Nicolae was a priest.
Yes, that was from Seraphim. So yes, I mean, it is interesting. I think I'll intervene with a question of my own, which was that he became a monk so late in his life. Was this to do with the persistence of communism, the persistence of the security services' interest in him, or was it really just a journey and progression through his life from intellectual and convert through to an eventual desire to become a monastic? I was interested to hear about that, if we can.
I know that he had that desire for a very long time. I think pretty soon after he left prison, he was dreaming in a sense that he would really want to join a monastery. I don't think he did it straight away for a number of reasons. One being that I think nobody was really willing to receive him, because he was a person of interest to the Secret Service. He was followed everywhere. All of his movements were surveilled. And I think that it would have been a great risk, to accept him in a given community. Indeed, a lot of communities just said no when he approached them, and it was only this brave starets of the Rohia monastery in Western Romania who took the risk and fought for him quite bravely, with the Secret Service. So, but it was also a journey. I think it was also something he allowed to ripen as he was navigating that very strange world of the 60s and 70s.
We have a couple of questions which are really about his Jewish background, and asking, firstly, what was his upbringing like as a child, and perhaps as a teenager and young adult? Was there any religious side to that? But also, is there anything about his Jewish background in the journal specifically, and did he continue to have connections with the Jewish community, well, I suppose through his life?
He was raised in the Judaic tradition, religiously, as far as I understand. In fact, he even co-authored a book on Judaism soon after he graduated from his PhD. So he was not a lapsed Jew, if you like. He was very much familiar and in connection with his religious roots from Judaism. He doesn't mention that very much in the journal, except to say that he encountered a degree of reticence, because he still met with his Jewish family, and there were some trouble. I think the way he describes it, initially they didn't want to believe that he had become a Christian. They just thought it's just a passing phase, because he's gone through so many hardships. Probably his mind has gone wrong, or maybe he just doesn't know what he's doing. So they didn't take it seriously at first. They weren't happy about it. I can tell you that. But eventually they accepted that that's actually something that's happened, and it's not just a sort of a momentary drive. He doesn't talk more about it. He doesn't talk critically about Judaism at all. He's only maybe a little bit sad that he can sense in them, the rest of his Jewish family, that they are a bit disapproving of his. But in a sense, of course, that's to be expected. But, no huge drama, though.
Mm. Thank you. Father Julian has asked whether he travelled much during his life. You've mentioned his interest in London. He mentioned those other places, Lucerne in Switzerland, and other places he's mentioned in his writings. But did he travel to them? Was he able to visit other monasteries as well?
Well, he visited monasteries in Romania, but very interestingly, he visited the monastic community of Chevetogne in Belgium, I believe in the 70s. He was allowed to circulate after a while, although he was being surveilled. And he spent, I believe, half a year in Chevetogne, and there were some suggestions that the community was inviting him to stay over, to remain part of the community there. He was already sort of interested in becoming a monastic.
Mm.
The Chevetogne is an interesting experiment. It's a Catholic monastery which serves also Orthodox liturgies. It's a sort of ecumenical, very unique ecumenical experiment, and he absolutely loved the ecumenical side of it, and he loved the thought that Catholics were becoming Orthodox during the serving of the Byzantine Rite liturgies. So it was a place he loved very much, but he wanted to return to Romania. I think he wanted very much. He had a great love for Romania. I haven't said that. He was absolutely in love with Romania, and he joked when people told him he was Jewish. He said, "Look, I'm 100% Jewish. I'm 1000% Romanian." He just had this deep love for Romania, for the places where he spent his childhood. There was a deep connection, almost spiritual. So I think that's, but eventually he settled in a Romanian monastery, and he was very, very happy that he did.
Mm. Alex has commented, rather than asked a question, but to say that it may have been that some of the common criminals in the prisons were used to apply corrections to the political prisoners, which may have been physical corrections as rather than anything else. So yeah, the interaction.
That is a possibility. It was practiced by communists. Steinhardt didn't go to Pitești. Pitești was a famous prison in Romania, a horrible place where they experimented with prisoners being torturers. So everybody got to be a torturer of the others. It was that was one of the most dehumanizing contexts imaginable, unparalleled, I think, in the whole world. But yes, that was encouraged often for some prisoners were made to beat or torture other prisoners, even in the more commonplace prisons like Jilava or Gherla or Aiud.
Yeah. Regina has mentioned that, perhaps his Jewish background made it difficult for him to follow the true light, but in some ways you've sort of talked about that a bit already that actually he found his way through this epiphany and through these experiences, and that could happen to anyone, whatever their background. But I suppose that's why. Sorry.
He was interested. He was always interested in Christianity. I should have mentioned that as well. I mentioned that in the previous presentation. First of all, even as a Jew, even as a young Jew, he showed great interest in Christianity and Christian theology. I guess it must have started with his curious, with his natural curiosity and his willingness to learn a lot about everything. But he also had deep connections, for instance, with the church in his native village. He was very fond of, when he went back home, he missed the church back home. He often speaks about the bells that resonate from his childhood. So there were connections there. And at some point, he went to Christian conferences, theological conferences. He read a lot of the fathers of the church. So when he went to prison, he knew a lot about Orthodox theology. He had read the important fathers. So he wasn't, learning entirely new things. The only new thing was the baptism. And even that, he confesses that he had taken that decision internally without realizing it, perhaps, but he just kept postponing it for various reasons. In fact, this sort of anxiety of breaking away from his family was one of the things that kept him from doing it, since we were talking about not because they were specifically anti-Christian, but simply because he knew that would inevitably lead to a breakaway from his family.
It was fascinating through the presentation how you talked about the connections with other experiences in prison, with Father Sergei Ovsyannikov and Solzhenitsyn, and David has asked about Father Dumitru Staniloae that you talked about a little, or you mentioned, and his work on the Philokalia, and whether they were in actual contact with each other, these links, the spiritual links, but the actual personal links as well. Were they in contact?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm sure they must have interacted in the Bucharest of those days. I'm not aware that he was in close contact or permanent contact. Surely he would have, I think he mentions him in the journal. He mentions Staniloae. He most certainly would have read him, but I'm not sure whether they necessarily frequented the same circles. But I may be wrong.
And we must remember that Romania is a big country. It's easy to forget that. We've got a quick question from Sarah. Had Father Nikolai's mother converted to Judaism on her marriage?
I don't think so. But the truth is, I don't know the circumstances about his parents. I know that he grew up with his father, and to my shame, I'm not even sure what happened with his mother. I'm assuming early death, but she did not convert, as far as I'm aware. So he was raised. That's a good question, actually, because he was raised presumably as a child in a mixed background, as it were. That also may have contributed to his later conversion.
Yeah. And Subdeacon Ian has asked whether Father Nikolai encountered prejudice after his conversion. I think you've mentioned that in passing a couple of times. Perhaps not, some monasteries were not as happy to accept him, and maybe there was some other prejudices around. I don't know what the situation would have been.
I'm British. I'm sure that he will definitely have encountered anti-Semitism in his day. But when you read the journal, you understand he's not the kind of person to complain about these things. If anything, and this is paradoxical, he speaks very kindly of some prisoners who had been in the Iron Guard. And the Iron Guard was, admittedly, we have to be nuanced when we talk about a phenomena like this, but essentially it was an anti-Semitic, pretty fascist organization. Not everybody in it was like that, presumably, because it was almost all the notable intellectuals of the day had leanings towards the right wing or the Iron Guard. I believe the more naive ones, as indeed Father Nicolae, they went for the patriotic element, which they found justifiable. But he, paradoxically, he praises a lot. He says that a lot of Iron Guard people were extremely nice to him in prison. So that's an interesting. Obviously, he's forgiven any such excess, but on the other hand, those may have been those Iron Guarders who were not necessarily anti-Semitic. It's a messy, complex situation.
Well, I think you've managed to answer all the questions which have so far been in the chat. I'll give a couple of minutes just in case anyone's got a final question. I do want to remind everyone that we hope that the book, the translation of Journal of Joy, will be out towards the end of this year or perhaps next year. So please do look out for that, and we'll try and advertise it at the fellowship as well so that people can get hold of it. I think Journey to Freedom is an excellent book to recommend as well, by Father Sergei, who died only a couple of years ago in Amsterdam.
I wasn't aware that he died. I'm sorry.
Yeah, yes, he did. Actually, he died in St. Petersburg, but he was serving in Amsterdam. But
memory eternal. I didn't know.
Indeed, and he's a wonderful person to link up with Metropolitan Anthony, who we'll be hearing about in a few weeks' time. I'm going to put the links that I mentioned in the chat again, just to remind you. There's the website link of the fellowship. Also a link to make a donation to the fellowship if you have enjoyed this talk. Even if it's a small donation, we would be grateful for it. We will put that towards our reducing the cost of our conference next year. And I would like again to thank Dr. Razvan for speaking to us about Father Nicolae. I find him an absolutely fascinating subject, and I can't wait to read more and hear more about him. And thank you again to everyone for joining us this evening. May I suggest you go on gallery view just before we leave, and then you can all wave at each other. Those of us who have our cameras on, you can put your camera on and wave at each other. It's lovely to see so many known people, but also people, hello everyone, to see so many people, names that I know, but also new people as well. Lovely waving. And I hope to see you again for one of the talks. Next Monday, we will be hearing about Saint Silouan and the newly glorified Saint Sophrony with Sister Magdalene from the monastery in Essex. So that will be a wonderful talk as well to continue our series. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good evening and see you soon, I very much hope. Bye everyone.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.